As you know, our embassy in Beirut was the target this morning of a vicious terrorist bombing.
In 1983, Islamic fundamentalism challenged the most powerful nation on earth.
Our policy will be one of swift and effective retribution.
Let's hurt the people who make these decisions.
The Pentagon instructed an undercover agent to devise that retribution.
We had names, we had locations.
Who were those people you were looking for?
Sheikh Fadlallah, the spiritual leader of Hezbollah, and he still is.
Frightening facts about the war that Reagan lost. States of Terror, Wednesday at 9:30 on BBC One.
On BBC Two shortly, one of the finest examples of the Western movie ever made. Robert McKee introduces Alan Ladd in the Oscar-winning Shane. Meanwhile, in 15 minutes, BBC One witnesses an astonishing ceremony high in the mountains of Peru, where Christian and Inca rituals combine on a legendary trail. That's after the BBC News now at 5 to 10 with Michael Burke.
The Anglo-Irish talks on Ulster are halfway to peace for the province, according to the Irish Prime Minister. Prayers for peace in Dublin today, as the Irish say the negotiations are firmly on course. The shuttle astronauts walk in space to mend the Hubble telescope, and the Bosnian war victims that Europe has forgotten. Good evening. The Irish Prime Minister, Albert Reynolds, has said his talks with John Major on a peace plan for Northern Ireland have reached agreement on half the points at issue. The two leaders will have more talks at the European Summit in Brussels on Friday. Irish and nationalist politicians have called on the Ulster Unionists to open talks with the government in Dublin. It's seen as part of a concerted effort to reassure Ulster loyalists about the peace process.
Everyone in Ireland has wanted peace for years, but there does seem to be a new edge to that desire, underlined by an ecumenical service at the Anglican St Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin this afternoon. The Irish President, Mary Robinson, joined Gordon Wilson, whose daughter was killed in the Enniskillen bombing, and Susan McHugh, who founded the Peace 93 movement, in hearing messages of support from John Major, read by the British ambassador, and from the Irish Prime Minister, who today insisted that half of a joint statement with Britain on peace is already agreed.
It is a new beginning we all want, that we are putting behind us the strategy, the futile strategy of the last 25 years by both sides, and indeed that the two governments clearly signal that, and that which will be followed on by the talks process. I think that hopefully the men of violence on both sides will be able to respond to that.
He also said he would put in writing his government's intention to change the Republic's claim to Northern Ireland.
I will put our present position in writing for anybody who wants it, if that's to help to assuage fears.
The British government would welcome such a declaration in the joint peace statement, and the Foreign Secretary was adamant that British attitudes to that constitutional claim had not changed.
There's been no softening on any point of principle. The principle here, and this is the key to the whole thing, is consent. And what is crucial, and I think is there, is that both governments accept that what counts are the views of the people of Northern Ireland.
On the same programme, the largest unionist party showed it's still in favour of the government's current efforts towards purely political agreement.
I'm confident that that will deliver, because you see what it will do will enable the people of Northern Ireland, and that is they have the key to it. It will enable them to find a common denominator position, which will enable them to work together, perhaps at a low level of administrative government, building up gradually to something higher.
Officials from the British and Irish governments start work on drafting a joint statement early this week. A lot of it is agreed, but the areas remaining are the problems, and considerable ones too. But both Prime Ministers seem determined to try and bring to reality the hopes for peace expressed at services like this one. Dennis Murray, BBC News, St Patrick's Cathedral, Dublin.
Two astronauts from the Space Shuttle Endeavour have successfully completed their first day of repairs to the damaged Hubble telescope. On the first of at least 5 planned spacewalks, Jeff Hoffman and Story Musgrave have replaced faulty gyroscopes. But they've had one setback, a solar panel that wouldn't fold up. They've now decided to let that drift off into space.
With the Earth more than 300 miles below, this morning astronauts prepared for their first spacewalk. Taking breakfast on the hoof, Story Musgrave and Jeff Hoffman put on their suits, then made their exit into the payload bay.
Okay, it's daylight outside, so you might want to put your visors down.
At the end of the 50-foot robot arm, Hoffman was ferried over to the telescope. There he had no trouble opening the doors.
The door is opening by itself.
With Story Musgrave inside the telescope, they began the task of replacing packs of electronics and gyroscopes needed to point the telescope. The telescope has 6 gyroscopes altogether, but 3 have failed since it was launched. With their task complete, they had a problem closing the doors because they were slightly warped.
Close the handle latch and then try to zipper it up, see if that works.
The 4 latches eventually shut, but this evening NASA faced their first real hitch. The solar array with the damaged strut got stuck when they tried to roll it up. Tomorrow, astronauts will jettison it in a well-rehearsed maneuver. At the end of the first successful spacewalk, America's Vice President today congratulated NASA on its achievement. But there are 4 more spacewalks to go before NASA completes the job, and then an 8-week wait until they know whether they've successfully repaired the main problem, the telescope's faulty focus. James Wilkinson, BBC News.
The Chancellor, Kenneth Clarke, has fiercely criticised an £80 billion economic revival plan by the European Commission. The strategy to invest in public works to create jobs was drafted by the Commission's President, Jacques Delors. Mr. Clarke said the proposals had been presented too late for proper discussion and could jeopardise agreement at next week's Heads of Government meeting in Brussels.
Construction work underway in Brussels. More heavy investment in the infrastructure could ensure jobs for some of the European Union's 17 million unemployed, according to the European Commission. It believes £80 billion a year could be spent between now and the end of the decade, used to build roads, railways and telecommunication networks. The plan requires a sharp rise in government spending on top of existing proposals. But the Chancellor of the Exchequer has dismissed the idea, insisting the Commission may have failed to deliver details in time for a decision at this week's summit of European leaders.
I hope that nobody thought a serious organisation like the European Union could be expecting to take decisions on matters of this kind in 3 days' time, when at this moment in time no one's seen a scrap of paper.
And most of the finance ministers reject the idea of extra public spending when they're trying hard to curb budget deficits at home. They're angry the Commission has ignored their concerns. This week's gathering of leaders has been billed for months as a summit for jobs, but now chaos threatens instead. A decision on a joint policy for tackling unemployment in doubt. Jonathan Charles, BBC News, Brussels.
The French Prime Minister, Edouard Balladur, said tonight there'd been excessive optimism about the prospects for a GATT World Trade Agreement before the deadline in 10 days' time. He was speaking after a meeting with Peter Sutherland, the Director General of GATT, who admitted there are still outstanding issues to be resolved. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade aims to lower export barriers worldwide. French farmers have warned they'll go bankrupt if they lose vital subsidies. European and American negotiators meet again in Brussels tomorrow. Italians have voted in the second round of their municipal elections, regarded as a dress rehearsal for a general election in the spring. Amid a series of corruption scandals, support for the old centre parties has collapsed, and several major cities, including Rome, are left with a straight choice between the neo-fascists and the far left. Early exit polls show the left narrowly ahead.
Will Italians give the extreme right another chance of returning to power 5 decades after the collapse of fascism? The question no longer sounds absurd. 2 weeks ago, the old centre parties were pummeled for their corruption and bad government. In today's runoff, voters, not just in Rome but all over Italy, are left with a choice of 2 names, one from the extreme right and one from the left. It looks as if this Roman neighbourhood will vote for Francesco Rutelli, the left-wing candidate. Not surprisingly, perhaps, this is the city's old Jewish ghetto. The fascists are remembered here as executioners. This woman voted for Rutelli. He represents progress and tolerance, she told us. This neighbourhood belongs to Gianfranco Fini and his extreme right-wing MSI party. After some hesitation, she admitted supporting Fini. We Italians have suffered a lot, this woman in mink told us. The elections in Rome and in many other cities are too close to call. What they represent is a country split almost equally between the right and the left, with millions of people voting for candidates they wouldn't have dreamt of supporting only a year ago. The leader of the MSI describes his movement as post-fascist. At a final election rally, many of his supporters are defectors from the old ruling parties. But it remains to be seen whether power will tame the extreme right or revive more sinister ambitions. Matt Fry, BBC News, Rome.
Doctors in Bosnia say hundreds of injured adults are being forgotten by European countries who are more concerned with rescuing children. 4 months after scores of children were airlifted in Operation Irma, surgeons in the town of Zenica say United Nations bureaucracy is preventing the wounded benefiting from Western treatment. From Zenica, Malcolm Brabant reports.
Hassan Mesha may never speak or eat properly again after a grenade blew his jaw and part of his lips away. Reconstruction surgery available in the West could restore these functions, but doctors say their appeals on his behalf have gone unheard. Harta Yasarovic was shot in the neck as she prepared a meal for her 8-year-old son in the kitchen of her home. Treatment abroad could help her speak again. If she stays in Zenica, she could be mute for life. Doctors in Bosnia had hoped that shattered lives like these might be improved by sympathetic Western hospitals after Operation Irma pricked the conscience of Europe. But hundreds of amputees and other seriously wounded civilians are still waiting in Bosnia's inadequate hospitals and in their homes.
I can't understand why they don't like to help us. And all people ask ourselves why they don't like to ask to help us.
The hospital says the United Nations promised 4 months ago to evacuate those people who couldn't be treated in Bosnia. 1,600 people are still waiting, and the list is growing daily. The suspicion here is that Western governments will continue to ignore the plight of sick adults because they're not as appealing as sick children. Malcolm Brabant, BBC News, Zenica.
6-year-old Irma Hadjimuratovic, whose suffering prompted the emergency airlift in August, is still in intensive care at Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital in London. Serious shrapnel wounds have left Irma permanently paralysed from the neck down, but staff say she's mentally alert, smiles often, and is learning English. The Social Security Secretary, Peter Lilly, has said the basic retirement pension is likely to continue forever. He said the government's aim was to create a strong, affordable welfare state, while encouraging more people to plan and pay for their own welfare provision. Labour said his plans would deepen the divide in British society.
Mr Lilly is mixing the pragmatic demands of day-to-day politics with his more Thatcherite instincts in the Social Security Review. Today he reaffirmed support for universal benefits and spoke of the practical difficulties of targeting. His favoured approach is basic state payments and much expanded private provision, while means testing all benefits has been rejected.
That's not something that we're interested in because it would mean tremendous disincentives to work and to save. But if you've got a basic provision provided by the state and the opportunity to build extra on top of that, that must be a good model.
He said the basic pension was safe and universal child benefit was a manifesto commitment. But after the next election,
we shall have to see.
Labour's Social Justice Commission, set up when Mr Smith became leader, is reviewing the same area as Mr Lilly. Their latest paper, out tomorrow, will stress the importance of cutting unemployment to ease the costs of running the welfare state. But a conference of left-wingers yesterday repeatedly expressed the fear that the Commission might recommend benefit cuts. They were offered some reassurance today.
We are not looking for short-term savings. We are not using talk of financial crisis as a cover for dismantling the welfare state. We recognise that it's got to modernise, it's got to adjust to different social circumstances. But at the end of the day, we want it to more effectively tackle poverty in our community.
The outcome of the government's review is bound to be very different from Labour's, but they share a common challenge: to devise policies which will make the welfare state affordable without alienating sections of their respective parties. Steve Richards, BBC News, Westminster.
In today's football, Blackburn Rovers went third in the Premiership, beating Chelsea 2-0. In the FA Cup, non-league Bath City had a surprise victory over third division Hereford United. Bath, currently 6th in the GM Vauxhall Conference, won the second round tie 2-1. Their winning goal, which came 11 minutes from the end, was a spectacular shot from substitute Paul Batty.
Batty's going to try it.
Bath now travel to First Division Stoke for the third round in January. The main news again, the Irish Prime Minister has said talks to bring peace to Northern Ireland are still firmly on course, although serious differences remain. That's the BBC News Tonight. Good night.
Good evening. The 24 hours of Monday coming should bring us all further rain and increasing winds. And a change after that to colder weather. For the time being, though, we have the day's showers still visible on the radar picture, mostly on the western side of the country, one or two getting inland on what is a fairly stiff westerly wind, at least for the northern half of the country. Lighter winds further south, and the Midlands could be a bit of mist tonight. But by tomorrow, southwesterly gales are quite likely in many places across the middle. They'll turn lighter as the rain dies out. For tonight, then, a mainly dry night, a little bit warmer than last night, but increasing winds and rain will push just into Northern Ireland and the Highlands of Scotland by dawn. Now that rain will push across most of Scotland, just into northern England during the morning, and keep travelling southeastwards, taking the strong winds with it. Some heavy bursts of rain are certainly possible, I suppose most likely on the western side of the hills. As the rain goes through, Scotland and Northern Ireland will see brighter skies, but showers, and showers later on in the day, possibly turning wintry. Further southeast, generally cloudy day and generally dry, just a little bit of sunshine. We might even see double figures down here, but a strong wind and lower temperatures mean it will feel quite cold further north. I look ahead to Tuesday then, day basically of sunshine and showers, much colder than we've had after an early frost, and some of those showers could well turn wintry. Well, that's all from me for now. Have a very good night.
Christmas music on BBC Two.
Plenty of nothing, and nothing's plenty for me. I got no car, I got no mule, I got no misery.
Christmas music on BBC Two.
A family is forced to confront the corrosive effects of Alzheimer's disease in the late film tonight here on BBC One. In an award-winning performance, Joanne Woodward stars in Do You Remember Love at 11:05. Before that, an astonishing voyage of discovery on an arduous annual pilgrimage that combines Christian beliefs with ancient Inca rituals of an intensity and fervour rarely witnessed in the outside world.